Okay, welcome to another YIVO Fellowship Lecture. Today's lecture is the Max Weinreich Fellowship Lecture in Eastern European Jewish Literature. It is funded by the Vladimir and Pearl Heifetz Memorial Fellowship and the Vivian Levsky-Hort Memorial Fellowship. Our lecturer today is Elaine Wilson. Elaine is a writer, literary translator, language instructor, and PhD candidate in the Department of Slavic Languages at Columbia University. She studies Russian and Yiddish literature at of the early Soviet period and is currently at work on her dissertation entitled The Soviet Exotic, Resistance and Revolution in Soviet Russian and Yiddish Literature, 1917 to 1935. She is the recipient of the Vladimir and Pearl Heifetz Memorial Fellowship and the Vivian Levsky-Hort Memorial Fellowship in Jewish Literature at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research for 2022-2023. And of course, we very much appreciate the support we've gotten from the Heifetz and Levsky-Hort families in support of these scholars. And if you are interested in helping to support these endeavors at the YIVO, please contact me or our development department. Ms. Wilson's lecture today is entitled Gaping Mouths and Leaning Towers, the Queer Geometries of Peretz Markish's long-form poems, De Kupe and Radyo. Please welcome Elaine Wilson.
Thank you all so much for joining in. I really am very grateful that you have chosen to listen to me share my research with you on this Tuesday afternoon. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now because I've prepared some slides for you. Again, let me just hide this view for a moment here, and then we'll get started. Okay. So once again, thank you all for being here. And without further ado, I will get started. But just to first maybe contextualize, this is from the first part of my dissertation, which the first chapter of my dissertation, and I'm reading Yiddish as well as Russian literature together. And what I'll be focusing on today are two long-form poems by the Yiddish poet Peretz Markish. Okay. Whirls of steel and glass lean and reach toward the heavens, simultaneously tilting and turning around internal cylinders housing a legislative body, a press bureau, and a radio station. This was the vision behind Vladimir Tatlin's monument to the Third International. Begun in 1918, Tatlin's project developed in part through discussions with his friend and fellow innovator, the poet, mathematician, and linguist Vladimir Chlebnikov. Chlebnikov sought to develop a universal language, for he believed that such a system could prove to be the new vortex that unites us, the integrator of the human race. The swirling steel supports of Tatlin's tower rhyme with Chlebnikov's vision of a unifying verbal vortex, their joint project, a Bolshevik Tower of Babel. And like Babel, Tatlin's tower was grandiose, ambitious, even precarious. In its very design, it keels dangerously to one side. It was perhaps inevitable that the tower was never built. Like Babel and all other utopian projects, it culminated in the only logical end, nowhere. The up-down tension of a vertical edifice, the tower, preoccupied many artists in the years immediately following the revolution. Among them was the Yiddish poet Peretz Markish. Taking as points of departure Markish's poemas or long-form poems De Kupe, the Mound, and Radyo, or radio broadcast, in this lecture, I will explore the contours of Markish's imagined edifices, breakdown, disintegration, reconstruction, and affordances of agency to spatial features constitute a common architectonic register that, first, articulates a just rage, and thereafter asserts a kind of transcendence through destruction and reconstruction. In both works, a towering structure that is at once material and metaphysical is subjected to the author's poetics of paradox. Up becomes down, in becomes out, and the line between life and death is blurry, if extant at all. Indeed, Markish's poemas manipulate space and language in order to speak to the anxieties of that most intimate spatial category, the body. and show how the body strives and suffers under rigid social and political frameworks. The architectural and bodily imagery of these texts then serves to first construct, then dismantle hegemonic authoritarian structure. Now, let us look to first die kupe, the Mound. Markish's die kupe is composed of 22 fragments that take a variety of poetic shapes, from sonnets to couplets to irregular verse. This poem is a response to the violence of the Russian Civil War and the pogroms it generated, most specifically the massacre in Horodych, Ukraine in 1920, in which over 200 Jews were murdered on the eve of Yom Kippur and left to rot for 2 days. Die kupe rages and wails in the language of the slain. The slaughtered victims in the verse are laid out one on top of the other, piled in a grisly mound that rails against the heavens. This poetic work, as I will discuss shortly, breaks down linguistic structures and norms and thus assumes a poetic stance that communicates and replicates the disorder of real and imagined worlds. But before we turn to the broken bricks with which Markish builds these worlds, let me first turn to their arrangement. I have said Markish's poema is a defiant response to catastrophe, and it looks unflinchingly on the most abhorrent images of death in order to reject death. The poem opens upon a view of the titular heap, and a singular voice speaks for and from the grave. The bodies that form the mound ultimately prove to be both the object of the poetic gaze and the poetic voice. From a singular perspective to a grisly chorus, the lone speaker of the early verse ultimately transforms into many voices emanating from many mouths. These mouths are important, not just for what they say, but for what they do. These gaping mouths form the structure and significance of the heap itself. They are voids that blaspheme. Much of the scholarship on this poem, most notably that of Roy Greenwald, Dovidorskis, and Seth Wolitz, has attended to the poem's play with the sacred and profane. What is most interesting for my study here, however, is the role of the mouth as orifice, as empty space. Wolitz observes that Markish demonstrates the vacuity of sacred forms with these mouths. And moreover, just as tension is generated by oppositional force, the negative space of Markish's mouths facilitates self-cancellation. In one example from the poem's third sequence, the poetic voice addresses the divine and expresses a wish to lock myself in prayer with you and move my lips and move my heart, reviling, cursing, and blaspheming. Markish turns the oral act of connection into oral gestures of rejection. Orifices are everywhere. The shape and significance of the oral utterance echoes throughout the poem's imagery. The hollow of a useless, overturned wagon, Earth's black thigh is marred by a gash, and the poetic voice invites the mad wind to scrape out whatever it desires from the mound of bodies. Markish's imagery is an abundance of absence. The mound spills out, then contracts upon itself. In sequence 5, the mound freely gushes from her crazed crimson out upon the seas and beyond. The vertical mass of the heap breaks down and disperses. Like Babel, the vertical ceases and begets movement across a horizontal plane. Yet this horizontal movement ultimately resumes an up-down trajectory. The mound transforms into a single hollow cavity. And near the poema's conclusion, in sequence 20, it transforms into a massive, thirsting, red-hot crater. All those mouths, gashes, and wounds gaping and oozing come together to generate a thick void that swallows and compresses all that it takes in. Everything, that is, save for the 10 Commandments, which the mound crater spits back to heaven. Wolitz has noted how self-cancellation of contradiction is achieved largely through the poem's preoccupation with consumption. He writes, all the archetypal imagery becomes personified, simplified, and assimilated into a gigantic consuming mouth. The rhetoric reduces all objects to one function, anthropomorphic consumers, and so creates claustrophobic pressure. I believe this pressure is crucial. The vertical mass of the heap, allegedly a protrusion, is paradoxically constructed through expressions of empty space. and thus the suggestion of a convex structure proves to be concave. Returning then to the single poetic voice that breaks away into many, the inversion of space taken together with the act of compression through constant consumption suggests a kind of implosion. Like a black hole, the singular explodes only to collapse in on itself. That self-contained universe of the poem breaks in sequence 3 when the poetic voice cries out, "Oh, soll Gott emet sich mit etwas kommen wenden, soll emet sich Gott etwas kommen sorgen." In this entreaty to outside and elsewhere, someone or something to make it right, we encounter a brief moment of lucidity in the fever dream and an earnest entreaty amid the voice's anguish and self-sure rage. It is not only a reminder of the external world, but more importantly, it presumes the potential for resistance. David Roskis asserts that, quote, "the outside world exists only to the extent that it is reflected within the poet himself," end quote. He also avers that the poetic I, quote, "has no biographic past. He is society at large, or every I reading the poem," end quote. I agree, though I do not so confidently employ the pronoun he, in large part because of the omnipresence of orifices. These concave sites, gashes, mouths, craters, all form the distinctly feminine Malkekupe or Malkebark. And for those who don't know Yiddish, Malka means queen. Markish unambiguously genders the paradoxical crater mound that spits at the heavens as female. De kupe is inseparable from the historical context in which it was composed, one of ever-increasing violence. Jewish bodies bore the brunt of this violence, certainly, perhaps even especially the female body. Elisa Bemperad's research on the pogroms of the Russian Civil War highlights the atrocities of sexual violence against women, which was often carried out in public and was an all too common feature of the pogroms, for nearly every report contained reference to sexual violence. Keeping in mind this historical reality, then, the exposure and exhibition of the bodies of the mound and their orgy of agony support my gendered reading of Markish's verse. Indeed, I embrace the distinctly gendered gesture of the Malkebarg. Flinging the 10 Commandments back to heaven, this queen heap enacts a gendered outcry of defiance that is twofold. It rejects both the anti-Jewish violence of the pogroms and the impotence of patriarchal order. There we go. In its conflation of religion, space, and time, the poetic voice invokes and intertwines distinct patriarchal traditions, Allah, Christos, Shaddai, conjoining them on the heap. And over all these patriarchal traditions rises the queen heap, an alternative order. Von Gode Welt, von Erden und von Himmeln, vermalke über alle Berg, wel ich dich kupe kreunen. Thereafter come the final throes of the patriarchy. Läuft Oispompen von sich der letzte Trupp in schimmeldicke Serre und huiliert op wie alte Ewe botteldicke Sultane Reichen. The grotesquerie of an orgy of mad old men is a reflection of the madness of an ineffectual old order. The poetic voice points to not only the impotence of these systems, but also their finality. Proliferation is impossible. These old and oafish sultana can only spill the letzte Tropfen of their semen, which has already spoiled. To bolster my argument, I enjoin Sarah Ahmed's theory of queer phenomenology to reorient and reconsider de Kupe's resistance to history and tradition. Ahmed posits that how we come to know and how we are in turn known is not simply dialogic, but interrelated with other bodies and beings. Quote, "The orientations we have towards others shape the contours of space by affecting relations of proximity and distance between bodies," end quote. Ahmed writes that the normative can be described in terms of the straight body, a body that appears in line. Things seem straight on the vertical axis when they are in line with other lines. When even one thing comes out of line with another thing, the effect is wonky or even queer. The impulse then to make straight and find vertical alignment is to pursue or even impose the normative, where normative is that which is the effect of the accepted repetition of bodily actions over time. This effect, by another name, might be called tradition. Ahmed encourages a redirection of attention toward different objects, especially those that deviate or are deviant, in order to read for the angle and thus offer a different slant to the concept of orientation itself. Markish's kupe is the poetic realization of the kinds of physically impossible spaces that captivated the likes of Elisitsky in the Bauhaus. It is irrational space with infinite extensibility into the background and foreground. If we recall how the mound collapses into crater, arises anew, and then ultimately disperses in all directions, we can see kind of harmony here with this idea of a constantly shifting reorientation. Instead of accepting a traditional reading of de kupe as patriarchal and phallic, I underscore how simultaneously the mound is malka, queen, and therefore it can hold contradiction as it extends in all directions. It is both and, many at once. In this attention to deviance, then, I encourage a non-normative, that is, queer perspective on the text. My reading of de kupe leverages its inherent queerness to ultimately replicate Markish's challenge to traditional order. Where other scholars have pointed to the phallic imagery of the heap and that the poetic voice likens to a middle finger raised to the heavens, I assert a complementary yonic element, a vaginal imagery that first balances, then breaks the phallic order. Where scholar Roy Greenwald posits interruption of martyrological legacy as penetration of the cycle of violence, I instead embrace the metaphor of dismemberment to highlight the crumbling of the edifice, almost a kind of castration. Greenwald asserts nothing in the poem escapes dismemberment, and my reading extends this to the force of history itself. Markish's inversion of the upward, the queen crater kupe, there it is, precludes further erection of that morbid edifice. And because I stumbled over my words, let me clarify, by morbid edifice, I mean that violent force of history. All those bodies piled up following the triumph of the revolution are subsumed, swallowed, and called into the crater in a conclusive act. The poetic eyes of de kupe reconsider traditional structures and official rhetoric, all the while keeping their gaze trained on something better. We may recall that the quote previously where there is this voice asking that someone or something might come and do or say something. So together with this in mind, implicit in this gaze elsewhere beyond this violence of history is a call to action, whether to preserve a belief or to break from the cycle of history. The sweep of de kupe's spatio-temporal landscape begs for some kind of intervention. It looks to the here, the poetics, the site of the pogrom, and the now of writing, 1921, 1922, before reaching into the past. He says, how packed the earth is with you, referring to the bodies and therefore legacies of victims, many graves over time. And he also looks to the future, noch euch, after you. There is a futurity. De kupe then looks for redemption. In a reversal of the traditional prayer of mourning at its opening, Kaddish, the poema inverts the project of sacred commemorative consolation. The poetic gaze does not look strictly to the past, but to this moment and then beyond to a future. Death then is not a site of nostalgia, but an impetus to action. So before I turn to de kupe's companion poema, Radyo, which functions as a kind of sequel, I would like to revisit Tatlin's Tower, the structure I have here on the slide before you, that utopian construction project with which I opened the lecture, because its symbolic significance holds, specifically for Radyo, and has contiguity with de kupe. Specifically for Radyo, it is relevant insofar as it represents elevation, levitation, and the dispersal of information. Remember, talking radio broadcasts. Tatlin's tower is relevant because, as I will expand upon shortly, Radyo too leans upon architectural imagery to express horror as well as hope. Moreover, the titular radio broadcast, like de Kupe's Malkeberg, turns the vertical downwards and then outwards, but this time a clear message is sent to the masses. The geometric gymnastics of collapsing towers, vectors becoming planes, cones, and points, harmonizes with Tatlin's monument to the Third International. Tatlin intended his tower to be an extension of the Earth's axis into space, a center of worldwide telegraphic and telephonic communication, and as an international meeting place for the proletariat. The dissemination of power, the dispersal of information and agency from above to below and then outward, noticing the parallels here, is a democratizing gesture and, as I see it, a move of sublimation. Sublimation in this context is the transformation out of violence into maneuvers of hope and action. It is an optimism rooted in longing, a perseverance against the odds. This is the power of which Gaston Bachelard speaks when he says, quote, "Sublimation in poetry towers above the psychology of the mundanely unhappy soul. For it is a fact that poetry possesses a felicity of its own, however great the tragedy it may be called upon to illustrate." End quote. This is the thrust of de Kupe and Radyo. No matter the morbidity of the texts, they do not illustrate total failure or total collapse, but instead articulate a longing for a better later elsewhere. Markish manipulates space and time in his works, spoken about the legacies of the victims, the noch eich, and we have this blasphemous crater mound wherein categories collapse into themselves. The resulting kinetic energy of the vertical made horizontal is the force behind this longing for and action towards liberation from historical cycles of violence and or the stagnation of authoritarianism. There we go. And herein lies the paradox and oblique resistance to Bolshevik rhetoric. Utopia is not a fixed point or an achievable place in time. Instead, it is nowhere, for the gaze of the Soviet subject is directed to multiple directions at once. And as the revolutionary ethos is rooted in reorientation, specifically a reorientation of power and perspective among the masses, only through a multiplicity of perspectives and their corresponding resultant efforts can any form of progress come about. These calls for change find a cautiously hopeful elaboration in Radyo. Coterminous in its writing and publication, and as I've intimated before, like a sequel to de Kupe, this long-form poem narrates the arrival of revolution across the former Russian Empire on messianic terms. Longer than its poetic precedent, Radyo is composed of 40 poetic fragments, each a complete poem within itself. Nonetheless, these 40 sections share a narrative thread that ultimately weaves through verses that describe the violence of the Civil War, the birth and arrival of a Christological figure and a folk hero, and then the destruction of Moscow and a radio broadcast that promises a new technological future. Split into two parts, the poema recounts in part one the violent birth pangs of revolution and the prophets of the new Bolshevik order. As if descending or recalling our Malka Kupe arising from this mountain, a poetic voice comes with tablets of starry letters heralding a new era. With this direct invocation of the 10 Commandments, Markish at once maintains and manipulates the Exodus narrative, setting up a didactic image through which he expounds and complicates the promise of the new Soviet world. He pairs the Exodus story with contemporary revolutionary themes in an overdetermined grand narrative of liberation and new faith. The figures who populate the verse range from such folkloric personas as Ivan Durak, Ivan Tsarevich. These are figures from Russian folklore, and they're actually kind of the same person. And they also range to the biblical figures of the Christ child and Moses, all of whom are appropriated and refashioned as proletarian prophets preaching secular salvation. Drawing upon Russian revolutionary rhetoric, Markish fashions his presentation of society through Slavic motifs in his address to a Jewish, that is, Yiddish-speaking audience. This is not necessarily a means of estrangement. Rather, it is a gesture of fusion. Markish links Moses, Vasilisa, the Christ child, and Ivan the fool turned prince with Jewish cultural topoi in order to articulate the common plight and thus shared inheritance of the new communist society. Ot reizt dort Ivan Tsarevich auf es Sphinx mit Vasilisa die verkischifte in die Augen. De brennendige Vogel wie Kesser auf die Hoim, das ganze Land wird ihm allein geheim. The mythical firebird, taken by Ivan Durak in the Russian folktale, is the treasure that secures the kingdom for the fool. This story recounts how the everyman assumes through force and fate a position of power. Markish equates this potent folkloric image and figure with the kesa, a crown. The word signifies at once both the classic headwear of regency and an ornament set upon the Torah scroll, and thus Markish unites the sacred, the secular, the Slavic, and the Semitic in his vision of the new Commonwealth. Section 2 opens with a depiction of the capital city, Kronstadt, on fire. And I will not read the lengthier passage, but I would like to call special attention to the lines, no one burning shall get out, no passerby shall get in. The destruction of Moscow and the image of the Kremlin consumed in flames echoes the collapse of the Mound and its transformation into a fiery crater in de kupe. The collapse here, however, is that of the institutional center of the Tsars, followed by the rise of new technology. The message of the radio rises and moves above and beyond the destruction to bring the good news of revolution to all the world. A radio, a radio, a radio der Welt. A reute stürmische Depeche, a wilde wicherische radio. Onwertige 10 geboten, a radio, a radio, a radio der Welt von Melech Glock, a radio von Moskva. The broadcast emanates from Moscow, the new omphalos of the world, and therefore not only establishes Moscow as the axis mundi, but reinforces the advance of the progressive future. I draw upon Seth Wolitz's metaphor of omphalos, not for its sense of centrality, but for its concavity, and thus its contiguity with the narrative and spatial metaphors of de kupe. As before, the central site of institutional power collapses, and Moscow functions metonymically as the message of revolution. Moscow is a center, yes, but only insofar as it is the starting point of a dispersion, for the Kronstadt is on fire, and no passerby shall get out, no passerby shall get in. What does survive is the radio broadcast and its outward moving call that echoes, or does it replace, the bells of the Kremlin, extending beyond the rubble of the imperial seat to hearken all to the revolutionary event. The new voice of mankind from the radio tower replaces the voice of God on Sinai, and so de kupe's plea to break from the cycle of history transforms in Radyo into the start of that very break. In Markish's verse, the metaphysical and the mythological assume great power. The cycle of Jewish martyrology denounced in de kupe is broken and replaced with the mythos of the triumph of the everyman. The broadcast from Moscow announces that the age of Ivan has dawned. For das ganze Land wird ihm allein gehören. The whole land will belong to him alone. The intersectionality of Slavic, Semitic, religious, and secular, represented by the motley crew of symbolic figures, and most especially Ivan Tsarevich Ivan Durak, speaks to the polyphony and multi-perspectival nature of revolution in Radyo. New Soviet identity is both and. Jew and Soviet are not mutually exclusive, but compatible coexistent facets of the self. The coexistence of allegedly opposing features, the princeliness and foolishness of Ivan Durak Tsarevich, or joint Soviet Slavic Jewish identity, maps onto the larger models of dynamic space and perspectives that I have articulated along the course of this lecture. And here I return to the question that first introduced the marginality and multidimensionality of Markish, the role of language. For as I've intimated, Markish's use of Yiddish is a polysemous political stance. And so I'll draw upon Benjamin Harshav, who has done great work in articulating the role of Yiddish, especially as we move from the 19th into the 20th century. So first, to contextualize, from the Middle Ages onward, Jewish life in Europe was grounded in a complex, distinct trilingual culture that operated in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Yiddish, with each of these languages possessing a separate library of texts, a separate educational system, an ethical movement, and a separate conceptual world. But together, they make up a culture that completely lacked aspects of territorial or statist power. According to Harshav, the definition of Jewishness in the religious polysystem was a legal definition. But Jewishness was defined by being a Jew and was included in the whole network, whereas in the new Jewish secular polysystem, it is voluntary and aspectual. If some of that is a little confusing, allow me to summarize by saying that moving into the 20th century, especially with the advent of the Russian Revolution and the equal status afforded to Jews, to assert one's Jewish identity and Soviet identity is a distinctly secular movement. That doesn't mean that it is robbed of any of the religious or cultural trappings, but it does attend to some of this secular Jewish identity that was a tension from the Middle Ages onward. And so Markish's voluntary use of Yiddish is as radical and willful a gesture as his blending of the sacred and profane and his bizarre cast of characters. With specific intention, he made the revolution a modern Jewish event. By carving out a distinct moment in existence, Markish and his contemporaries writing in Yiddish were asserting their place, not in accord with any clear national borders, but rather their unique position within the eternity of Jewish and secular history. Poets' use of their own Jewish temporality asserted a marginal perspective within the broader discourse, and it thus added a unique ideological configuration to the perceptual grid of modernism. And here I'd like to attend to the fact that Yiddish as a marginal stateless language folds in one more level of this kind of reorientation or a non-normative take, particularly when we speak about modernism in the Russian or Soviet context, which is so often read and conceived of strictly through a Russophone lens. And Yiddish, a stateless tongue, the language of the Jewish street, thus functioned as a kind of passport to the new era, inscribing Jewish time and identity into the secular universal. Markish, as we have seen along the way, did not write in simple Yiddish, but in a distinctly fractured verse that Karolina Tsmaniak has characterized as a language of confusion and dispersion. In this distinctly modernist idiom, Markish sought to disorient and thus reorient perspectives on tradition as well as new pathways forward. He believed that the aesthetic consumes the ethical, thus rendering prescriptive models obsolete as it makes way for new artistic frameworks. And so here I've tried to, this is a lovely pun that he makes in his famous manifesto, Ästhetik von Kampf in der marginal Dichtung, the aesthetics of struggle in modern belles lettres, where he takes aesthetic, splits it into two separate words that literally is third person singular. He eats, in this case, the aesthetic eats ethics. Markish does this in his takedown of institutional powers in disorienting Yiddish verse. Markish does not just interrogate legacies of failure, but also how the heirs to these legacies might make sense of and combat their hold on culture. The verse of Radyo is therefore unable to assume an unambiguously positive tone. The one who sparks revolution is an unenviable hero. And here I'll just give you the English. Don't envy him for hanging the royal bell on the strangled throat of the world, for the first toll ringing out in the heart of the abyss. Don't begrudge him. Don't envy him for lighting the first candle, the inaugural flame. Don't envy him, it's burning, growing. We have here an ambiguous approach. Markish at once communicates a sense of horror in the face of violence of revolution, but also a kind of ecstasy. A royal bell may strangle the world, but it also rings out in the abyss, and fire consumes, but it also lights the way. Light is inevitably entangled with darkness, but the light is growing and winning. Markish's inability to subscribe to homogenizing doctrine, to pick an absolute position, underscores the nowhereness of utopia. For like the melting mound that proves to be everywhere at once, the consuming fire that originates in the Kronstadt spreads out to envelop the whole world in red flame. And as if an inversion of de kupe, where the holy mountain Sinai, bearing the law, becomes a crater, in Radyo, the sunken cry of revolution first emerges from the depths before moving onward and outward from the vertical radio tower and then on to all the world. So in conclusion, in Markish, the collapse of space and time, the concave made convex, and the dead made animate are dynamic aesthetic gestures. This dynamism is suggestive of a kind of oppositional propulsion, one that refuses logic and natural law, and in its process of self-cancellation takes up, then takes down the force of historical violence. De kupe highlights the destructive forces at work within the greater social edifice, expressing the gravity of the situation as gravitational force. Up is tempered with down, mount collapses into crater. Oozing, spitting, and otherwise expunging the trappings of tradition, the mound rejects its old foundations, transforming into the hollow of a foundation pit upon which the new social edifice might be reconstructed. De kupe and Radyo together project an escape from violence in the promised era of new technology, and they do so with an eye to inclusion. Markish's alternative architectures, with their strange contours and gendered subtexts, link the social and political body and ultimately highlight the instability of ideological rigor. Markish demonstrates through a disorienting and thus reorienting gaze how the social body is not two-dimensional, but composed of a dynamic, queer geometry. The kinetic energy of revolution, then, is the constant shift of reconsideration. A mound is a pit, a mountain a crater. Violence, though abhorrent, can prove sublime. The phallic cannot exist without the yonic. Destruction is at once end and beginning, and the grave can even be rebirth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elaine. That was really fascinating and a compelling, reading of these works. Markish, for anyone involved in Yiddish literature, is always, an incredibly compelling figure. Obviously we see that, that his works are always fascinating. I'm just curious, and we'll get to, if anyone has questions, please put them in the Q&A. I'm curious to know, and I don't know if you could answer this question, if this is part of, this chapter or not. But, these readings of these poems by Wallets and Roskies and Griezmal and now you, are these sort of very modern views. And I'm curious if there's any connection with the way in which these works were received when they came out, if that's something that you've looked into at all.
That is a question that I can only answer by virtue of things that I have discovered while reading around the research on these texts, but it has not been a major feature of the work I've been doing. But something that I think is really important to think of first is the nature of this moment, the nature of, sorry about that buzzer, the nature of this modernist moment, which is all about kind of taking the old and remaking it, reconfiguring it, throwing it out. And this is happening not just in Yiddish, but across the landscape of Europe. And so there was certainly a kind of rapture, I think, in the way that it was perceived, not only because of what he's doing with the language, but also how he performs it. And Carolina Tsmaniak, who I did quote throughout the course of the talk, speaks to the nature of his language, but she also has this beautiful piece on Markish's manifestos where she talks about his performance and how he would be filled, like he would just be drenched in sweat and there'd be a puddle around his feet at the end of reciting works or even just kind of riffing. And people were captivated, horrified, and also sort of enchanted. And so I think that a lot of what he is doing insofar as, he's constructing the text is, trying to create that sense of revulsion and ecstasy in the reader too. And so it's very, very evocative. The other thing that I suppose is, just to answer your question on reception, this is actually perhaps more about the creation of, or the impetus to write die Kupe, but Markish is responding to not just the horrors of this violence, but also to another text that exists at this moment in the city of slaughter, Bialik's poem, and so, which is also kind of struggling with these legacies of violence, and but does so in a way that is not quite as provocative as Markish. And I remember reading that, oh goodness, it flies out of my head at this moment, who it was he was speaking with. But one of his contemporaries was saying, like, why not go to the site of the pogrom? Why not go there and actually see it for yourself before you write it? And Markish, in almost an assertion of a kind of new stance and a rejection of this violence, says, I can see the Mound from here. And there's something, there's just like an incredible arrogance to it that I know was both off-putting and insanely charming. He was also called the most handsome man in Europe at one point, as I remember, and he was very cute. I should have put a picture of him in the slides.
Right. Yeah. Yes. I mean, I've seen many of the pictures, and he's very attractive.
Very dashing, a bit manic.
Yeah. Yes. Right. All right. Well, let's get to some questions from the audience. David Bergman asks, how do you reconcile the unifying image of Radyo with the disembodied and queer version of the kupe?
So I perhaps did not do a sufficient job of explaining that once I moved into Radyo, but I see these as contiguous and complementary works, because this destructive and then reconstructive force that coexist and simultaneously participate in each poem is pushing things into different directions or dispersing any sort of central idea. So we have this mound that just becomes crater but melts, goes everywhere. With Radyo, we have the burning of a city, then the erection of this radio tower, and the dispersal of information. So there's a harmony absolutely in these spatial metaphors and the way in which they're moving. The queerness, which I perhaps did not emphasize sufficiently in the section on Radyo, is really this continuation of a non-normative understanding of space and time, and a push to not only conceive of things from this non-normative perspective, but also to proliferate it. That being sort of this revolutionary ethos where, again, I'll harken back to the sort of underpinnings of the modernist movement, which is, we're just going to take things, we're going to constantly break them and make them again. And so queer here, especially as I'm using it with Sarah Ahmed, leans heavily upon this idea of like a process of reconfiguring how you think through things. And yes, some of that, and non-normative modes of being as a result of how you think through these things. That is certainly rooted in queer theory as we think of it from the perspective of sexual orientation, but that is too limiting and certainly not necessarily useful here. Ahmed's whole point is to think about non-normative modes of being, not just about who you love or how you enact your sexuality, but how you enact being in the world at large, and how that is in tension with prescribed norms. So I hope that that has helped to elucidate both the larger argument as well as how it's functioning within the context of Radyo.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Annalena Torres, who always has good questions.
Always.
She wants to know if if you can have some insight into the role of animality in the poema, and how might the presence of so many wild animals, who she says gaze and approach or rebuke the heap, relate to the schemas of masculine and feminine, quote unquote, human bodies that you describe?
That is such an excellent question, and absolutely something that I want to think through a bit longer before trying to put together a lengthy answer. But I will, in the context of these poems, I have much to think through, but I'm so excited by this question because it actually ties in kind of nicely with the work that I'm doing in my second chapter, which is on Moshe Pullbach Zelmanyaner, in which I'm really considering how this, so this queer phenomenology is really the overarching theoretical lens for my entire project. And these modes of being and how we come to understand things, all interrelational. It's not just me and you, it's me and you and you and you and that and this and everything around us, and how that shapes the contours of space. And so these animals absolutely are important. In Zelmanyaner, there's a clear ecological undercurrent, or at least an environmental undercurrent to that text that is going to serve as my touchstone to sort of get me thinking through Professor Torres's question. And that is to say that there's an interconnectedness, and there's a certain concern for that interconnectedness with the place in which you live, and the place in which you like, and how you enact your sense of self within that place, and then how that establishes certain modes for your future. And this is very much at the heart, I think, of the sort of Soviet Jewish question at this moment. And again, I don't want to make that sound as though I'm reducing this to animality. I'm thinking about this in the larger context of networks, but the way in the way in which like the sun, the grain, all of these things are interplaying and like reflecting the tension between like, am I Soviet, am I Jewish, do I like industrialization, do I really like tradition, that's playing out in Zelmanyaner, seems to be a really like productive site of trying to just work through the question on a really big stage. And this is all to say the animals are important. I have not sufficiently thought about them because I was so caught up in this, well, this phallic yonic thing. So now I must incorporate animality, and I will make a note, and I will email.
Okay, thanks. And again, if anyone has a question, please put it in the Q&A section. Now we have a question from Cole Fishman. Cole wonders about the use of dismemberment and the implications of origin and possible unification, and your discussion of the new Soviet identity of both / and. And Cole also asks about the Soviet Jewish, if you could speak more of the Soviet Jewish experience in relation to those who confusedly spoke of themselves as, quote, doubly chosen, unquote, as Jewish, Soviet, and Christian toward the end of the Soviet Union. Are all of these terms then trying to explain identity outside of the binaries and to wander into new definitions that are not so rigid or traditional?
Thank you, Cole. This is really productive line of thinking. The implications of origin and possible unification with new Soviet identity. I mean, you probably got the point from my talk that there's a sort of like feminist and queer theory undercurrent here, where I'm really trying to push for this non-masculine order, which is definitely something that's a big question at this early moment in time. And in the broader context of the dissertation, I've been thinking a lot about the covenant, which, because the book of Exodus serves as a theoretical matrix. I promise I'm getting to a point. I'm not trying to detour us or derail us here, but the covenant, we think of the first one and the mark of circumcision, but this is specifically linked to the masculine body. And so when we start thinking about revolution in and Exodus and the covenant at Sinai. Michael Walzer, a big political theorist who specifically writes on Exodus and Revolution, speaks to the kind of choosiness of this second covenant. And there's a tension, of course, between like being born into Jewishness versus, accepting the covenant as everyone does at Sinai. But there's a kind of inclusive gesture in that. And so if we're using Exodus as this template for revolution and as this moment, then yeah, I think there is something kind of interesting perhaps going on with this non-gender specific idea. This dismemberment, or right, this circumcision, or anything that's sort of rejecting the phallic order. So I hope that attends to your first question. And then I'm looking at the text here so that I properly remember what you've asked. In relation to those who confusedly spoke of themselves as doubly chosen, as Jewish, Soviet, and Christian. This is something where I think I will more so direct you to other scholars who have thought through this across a much longer period of time, since I'm so rooted in this moment of the early 20th century. I mean, Judith Kornblatt, of course, has doubly chosen. And then also Sasha Senderovich's new book, How the Soviet Jew Was Made, looks at this question, not just in the moment that I am examining here, but also really up to the end of the Soviet Union. And this is a tricky thing. I don't want to make assumptions. I don't want to try and like ascribe significance where it may not exist. But I do think that a lot of this plurality of identity, this multiplicity of a sense of self, and then once we get into the Stalinist era and we have these more rigid strictures and the growth in anti-Semitism, it certainly not only compels people to diminish the more traditional or perhaps religious side of that identity for the sake of just living a more comfortable existence, but also to what extent is the dilution of practice then just kind of by virtue of inertia carried through. And this is to say it is to some extent a force of history, a force of that violent history that Markish is speaking to. But also, again, something that I'm not directly engaged with. So that is my very, I suppose, unsatisfying response to your question here.
Okay, that seems to be it for questions. Thanks so much to all of you who attended, and thanks so much to Elaine Wilson, the 2022-2023 recipient of the Vladimir and Pearl Heifetz Memorial Fellowship and the Vivian Levsky-Hort Memorial Fellowship in East European Jewish Literature. Again, we thank those families for their support, and if you like what you heard today, please consider making a donation to the Evo, because we can't do this without your support. Thanks so much, Elaine. It was really, really fascinating.
Thank you.